Hi, peeps.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
All right. So it's Thoughtful Thursdays again. After a small break, we're resuming, and this time we're going to talk about a movie called Harmony by Shitoshi Ito, also known as Project Ito. With me, I have William.
Yeah, all that's going to be ducked out. It's your boy, Fearless Billy Nuwanda, guys.
Okay.
What's up, peeps? Thank you for the support. And joining us is Housecat, who is currently wanting lots and lots of pettings. Harmony was part of a trilogy of films made by the Notima block in Japan, each one being handled by a different director. And, this is the second of them. The third one, which was released in Japan late last year, is coming in, which is coming over here soon, is Genocidal Organ. Pretty soon, so, yeah. Critically acclaimed writer. Unfortunately, very posthumously. Had a lot of issues and passed away due to cancer very young. So, yeah, even Housecat agrees.
Yeah, he won the Philip K. Dick Award in 2010 for Harmony.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's, with this movie, there's a lot of really interesting stuff to unpack. It is a very, for a lot of, dank anime fans who are, heavily into shonen-related stuff, this is not going to be the movie for you. This is going to be a lot more about conversation. It's going to be a lot more about dialogue. I think, the best, equivalent as far as movies go is, when you go into Clerks thinking that you're going to get Transformers. That's kind of, a really good deal. It's much more about conversation and dialogue and what's going on in the characters' heads, the motivations and whatnot. And there's also some really good macro bits to consider as well. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about tonight. So, Don, I'll let you kind of take the charge on that.
Okay. First of all, I think what is very interesting about this movie in particular is that all the protagonists are females, with very few exceptions. Some male characters are in the show, but they're as secondary characters. The main characters are female, and they guide the story, and they are the heroes and the anti-heroes, and spoilers, the victims as well of the situation. So what the movie is about a world, specifically Japan, of course, where there's a chip in your body that after 21, would it be, or 18?
I think it's
between 18
I think
and
it's
21.
18, yeah, if I remember correctly.
No,
it's 13. That's right, it's 13.
13.
Yeah.
Okay. It goes off, and that chip allows you to age slower, and it controls all of your metabolic functions and everything that your body does in order for you to be healthy. And so it's a miracle, because you don't have to worry about anything after that. And that is precisely the whole motivation behind the story, because the main conflict here is individuality versus being part of the masses, being part of the greater good. So once you hit 13, you can't do anything about it. Everything is monitored for you, and you don't have any choice. So a couple of the lines in the show is that you don't have the choice of fucking yourself up. You don't have the choice of getting fat, of getting drunk, getting, high. So the anti-heroine of our story is going against this system, and it places some very interesting questions also about teenage, adolescent angst. This idea that our anti-hero has a very particular strong will, which later on in the story we know that has been with her from the very beginning, from the age of 8, when she is discovered and she's adopted by a family and she grows up in Japan. So it's this question about nature versus nurture. Can we do anything to fight against fate or destiny? Are we destined to be strong-willed, or do we make ourselves have a strong will and make our own choices?
I'd just like to kind of like go back and like talk about some bits, like, and unpack this a little bit. It is an interesting caveat that they went with primarily a female cast, with males being more of the secondary characters, mainly because when you associate with females in general, you associate more about emotion and, not as much on the logical side of things, which makes sense considering the motivations and a lot of the pathologies that Tuon, the main protagonist, displays throughout the film. Almost all of her decision making is based off of more of an emotional decision making rather than a logical decision making process. She pursues this all the way into the end in the pursuit of her, her friend who she thought was dead, but spoilers, is actually alive. So yeah, I thought that was kind of an interesting play on things, and a lot of the movie also revolves around that, how your adolescence can really shape your identity as an adult, because when they were kids, or at 12, they were making this pact that they were going to commit suicide, with the whole point being, we don't want to, yes, we know this thing can make us, feel better and live longer, and, have a more productive and happier life, but at the same token, this kind of robs of us of our free will. Our free will is that we want to be able to fuck it up. And it's kind of hard to do that when you have an implant that actually, controls your entire genetic modification. They even say in the movie, they can even control your breast size. Everything is mandated for you. So you have that kind of conflict going on in the story as well, and that influences the girls to take because of the lead anti-heroine of the story, whose name escapes the both of us for right now. I'll probably have to look this up while Adan's talking in a little bit. But,
Neon.
Neon. Okay, there we go. She takes a very nihilistic POV about everything. And, of course, you don't get the reasons why for it until later on. But it makes a very profound impact on Tuon and the others, like going into adulthood. Especially because initially they believed she was dead. So you have those kind of two things that are already starting to come up there. And, like, again, because this is much more of an emotional journey, it can also throw a lot of viewers off. Because the story does not come to a necessarily logical conclusion.
You need to be patient with this movie.
Yeah, very much so.
Because it really depends so much on emotion that if you're not following the emotions of the movie, you'll get easily bored.
Yeah, very, very, very true. But yeah, let's kind of unpack some of this a little bit. So, again, going into the main character Tuon, she's somebody who very much seems trapped as her 12-year-old self, even being 22. Since, the main plot takes place 10 years later. So yeah, like how, like, what are your thoughts on how like adolescence can impact someone's adulthood?
Well, I think it's interesting that you mention this fact that they got stuck at that point where they tried to commit suicide because she, in the movie, she physically escapes Japan. Interestingly enough, in the way they develop her character is that she becomes an elite soldier, but she's also smart and she's also athletic and blah blah, so she's perfect. But she's escaping Japan because she can't stand this idea of not having individuality, not having free will, not having choice about how she lives her life. And what I thought was, I think, very artistically beautiful was that in the beginning of the movie, the heroine of the story is in a desert, and she's doing some shady exchanges with some rebels against the system, which is Watch Me, you know, like Big Brother. And the people that she's doing these shady businesses with are called the Tuareg. And these are actually it's a real tribe in Africa. And according to the movie, Tuareg means people that were abandoned by God. So I thought that was pretty interesting because they have this... Well, the intention of the movie, in my opinion, is to place science as God. So they are abandoned by God, which is, in this case, science. And the character, the leader of the tribe, is constantly... It tells her at least 3 times that everything in moderation is what you're looking for in life. To live, you know, a healthy life. And in the case of Tuan, she keeps saying over and over that Japan, specifically in this case, is hell because they're killing people with kindness. So you have these extremes of people being killed by savagery and violence and war, and then you have the other extreme of people not being humans because it's been extirpated, you know, it's been extracted, it's been dissected through this chip in them.
Yeah, that is true, you know, and kind of backing up a little bit to the Japan talk, you know, it also matches a very popular, you know, breakdown of Japan in that the way that its culture is built up is it's built specifically for conformity and for uniformity, which is why, you know, again, you see a lot of manga and anime authors and series do everything they can to kind of like rebel against that system, because the way the system is built is that you slog through school, you slog through university, then you become a salaryman, or if you're a woman, you become a salary woman until then you get a kid, then you immediately retire from work and you become a stay-at-home mom forevermore. It's like you have a very dictated life cycle that you're supposed to lead. And a lot of creators tend to do more works that are designed to fight against that. So I did think that was interesting, especially like you see a lot of really neat visual shots in the beginning, which kind of depict this sort of, you know, utopian society, but it's like very, like they use the color pink a lot, which I thought was really interesting because it kind of like conveys that, you know, this is sanitized. This is, you know, what we feel is perfection. You know, yeah, I thought that was a really interesting bit on that.
Yeah, continuing on the visuals, in the very beginning, you get the feeling that it's going to be a somber movie because the character is waiting by herself. So she's lying down and sitting down on this metal thing, Well, she's waiting for the tribe that she's gonna do some.
It's like it's a Tumblr.
Yeah.
Essentially, yeah. If you've seen Batman, it's a Tumblr.
And so she's there by herself, looking at nothing really, because she's in the desert. So she's looking at. So, like, I can see that as being a reflection of herself. She's looking at nothing because, like you mentioned earlier, she got stuck when she was 12, and she hasn't moved beyond that.
Yeah, and it's like it's kind of at that point where, like, a lot of the monologues, like throughout the movie, she goes through all these internal monologues, which are constantly reinforcing that same feeling of being stuck. You know, and unfortunately, like, when you're that age, that's the kind of stuff you're constantly thinking about. Is, you know, like, you know, oh, the system is down, and, you know, woe is me kind of stuff. And, like, when you get into adulthood, you kind of learn to live with it and deal with it, and also focus on at least making yourself, you know, better, one way or the other. Whereas you have this character in Tuan who is incapable of doing that, and that kind of guides a lot of her actions throughout the story.
Yeah. Another visual that I don't know if you noticed is the sun as being the center of what's going around the sun. So you see the sunflowers, you know, rows and rows and rows of sunflowers, which could be the equivalent of society, you know, that is just looking at the sun and just following the sun. You know, almost, you know, zombie-like, not being very reflective about it, just following it like an instinct. You know, no reflection, no analysis, just going through with it.
Just going through the motions, which is kind of like ironic considering that when you find out about what harmony truly is later on. Which, you know, spoilers, but harmony is like the last resort of the Watch Me system. Again, they establish the fact that this system is implanted in you and has the ability to change your entire genome coding. One of the other things it can do is it taps into your brain. And harmony is designed to be the absolute last resort, to where if mankind cannot overcome their nature, then they will be nurtured into sunflowers. That means that, like, essentially a system will kick in and overwrite your free will, and you exist without your consciousness.
And this sense of entrapment is seen throughout the movie as well, because there's this juxtaposition of ideas between nature and nurture, where nature is seen as very limiting and very like the plants that are covering the buildings. You know, it's like an X. I don't know if you noticed, like the X going over it. So it's not letting it looks like the building can't go anywhere, even if it could. I mean, that's the idea that you get. Like people, you know, they can't grow and they can't do anything with their lives. You know, they don't have a will because their nature, you know, being their forced nature, they're
being nurtured.
Yeah,
they're being nurtured, because even in the beginning of the movie, like, you know that Watch Me ends up altering a lot of their emotional states to begin with.
Right.
So
there's this very interesting, very enlightening scene, I think, in the movie where, of course, the heroine gets caught doing something that she shouldn't have done, and so she gets sent back to Japan. And like you said, she reacts kind of very adolescent-like and throws a tantrum and says, "No, I don't want to go back to Japan. I escaped Japan. I don't want to go back." And then she's in the metro. She's met there by her friend, who was part of the system from the beginning. Later on, we realized that she didn't even thought that committing suicide, which was part of their master plan to go against the system and give the finger to the system, never believed that was a good idea. She meets her at the airport, and in the airport, like, you hear in the background, like, instructions on how to behave. Like, smile to your, fellow human being, be kind, blah, 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 do this, do that. And then when they're in the metro, inside the train, you kind of get this idea that she goes, the Tuan, which is the heroine, she goes back and has a flashback, and she experiences, like, some sort of post-traumatic stress disorder of some kind, and she starts fainting. And one of the passengers asks her, please sit down. I don't want anything bad to happen, if I can help it. And she rejects it, and she says that she can't stand hypocrisy. In other words, like, she knows she really doesn't feel that. She's been brainwashed, programmed.
Yeah, like, a really telling scene is when she's going through the little escalator. Everybody, you notice in the scene, everybody looks up and smiles at her, no matter what. Mainly because they realize that she's a Helix inspector. She's one of the bigwigs of the world.
Yeah.
So, yeah, like, that kind of, like, again, that conformity, that forced nurturing is kind of at play here. Which, you kind of start to see, like, the thing about Harmony is that, like, it starts off with this concept of, like, this nature versus nurture deal, and then it goes away for a little bit as, like, like, our heroine, takes on the case, like, because what ends up happening is that, like, out of nowhere, in the middle of talking to her friend kills herself. And then it begins the detective case. This is basically the case of, we've got to move the plot along now. So they have her traveling to different locales. They have her trying to figure out, put all the clues together. And they during the course of that, they discover, of course, that her friend is alive. And they then go through the backstory, which, again, it's one of those deals where you really got to sit down and kind of pay attention to it and think about it. Because if you don't, it's not going to make any of this make any sense. Unless you, again, keep in the mindset that these girls, again, locked themselves in an adolescence. They had traumatic stuff happen to them, and that's why they can't progress as a result. So their motivations don't make any sense to the viewer unless you keep that in mind. Now, taking into account, our anti-heroine,
Neok.
Alright. You don't find out until really late in the movie that she was adopted. And that even morehand, she was adopted from a very small tribe in Chechnya, which all had the characteristic of not having all of their brain functions developed, so they essentially don't have a consciousness natively. It has to be something that's awoken. And for her, it was awoken when she was continually raped, when she was kidnapped by a enemy army during the Cataclysm period that happened in the universe's past. And that caused her consciousness to awaken in the worst way possible, which fueled her nihilistic way of thinking, which then influenced Tuon and Sion in the course of their course of the movie. And what ends up happening is you think, okay, like, you're initially told she's dead, you find out she's not dead, that she survived her suicide attempt, but instead they took her to be the test candidate for Harmony because she was the perfect person to test it against. It's like, what happens when you take this girl who's, like, going through this torment and rage because of her consciousness being forcibly awakened, and you put her into a system in which is supposed to deprive you of your consciousness? And you find out she liked it because it allowed her to escape that trauma that she experienced as a kid. So you then find out that the whole time she's the one that's been hijacking the system along with a few others to force the higher-ups that control the WHO to enact Harmony because she wants to do it for a very selfish reason. She wants to go back to, again, being a kid.
I think there's a part in the movie towards the end where I think in her case, in the case of Nyok, I think like Tuan told her, like you never change. You don't want to be alone. So I think it was selfish, but at the same time, she wanted other people to be part of it. Even though it was completely forced, even though she made it happen, it just didn't happen naturally.
Well, I mean, you got to, of course, keep him from the tribe. That living existence without a consciousness, so to speak. That's all that they knew. So for her, she was just trying to go back to the natural state that she knew from when she was a baby, and like growing up as a little kid, because to her, that is the ideal life. Because the moment that she got ripped out from that, it was all, one incredibly horrible situation after another. From, having to deal with being in the sex slavery bit to then having to go to Japan and then have the Watch Me installed and, like, having to live out your life under this, dealing with this, system of conformity. It makes perfect sense why she wants to just say, screw it all. I'll force them to trigger harmony so we can all just, you should, like, my way is the best way.
Mm-hmm.
Again, being very selfishly about that. In the final confrontation with Tuon, she was being really selfish. It's just like, she wasn't even making much sense in her actual dialogue. It was all just like, let's go be happy kind of stuff. And that's actually the final thing that causes Tuon to break, and that's why she kills her.
And I think that's another very interesting fact, because this idea of my way or the highway is a very adolescent idea.
Mm-hmm.
Where Tuan says, like, I'll go with you to the ends of hell, but I want you as you are right now, so I will kill you. Because I want you to be that way. I don't want you to go into... I don't want to see you go into harmony. I want to see you as you are until you die, and I will kill you.
Yeah, I mean, it was basically a situation where when Tuon realizes that the adolescent things that she's held on to ever since she was 12 are just are based off of adolescence, and that's not truly living and growing and changing, I think that's the moment when she has to make the decision to pull the trigger. Because at the end of the day, like, again, spoilers, harmony gets activated no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
So no matter what, like, everybody is going to go under it. The Miak still wins. But for Tuon, it's basically embracing the fact that no matter what, even before she loses her consciousness, she again is choosing the nature over nurture. So...
And the reason why it's activated is because a series of suicides are triggered by Nyok hacking into the system and making people kill themselves, or tell them that if they don't kill themselves, they will hack the system in a way that they'll die unless they kill another person. So they're put in a situation where there's not a solution. There's not a happy ending.
Yeah, it's essentially a Kobayashi Maru kind of situation.
She's forcing harmony to be activated.
Yeah.
One way or another.
Pretty much. And so you already know, like, again, this isn't a movie about where they're trying to, like, get to something, like, necessarily reach a full end goal. This is basically a movie about confrontations and about, having to make the painful choice to leave your childhood behind. And it doesn't really come up until the end again, but I think, like, again, when she makes the decision to pull the trigger, that's a decision where, it's like, she probably realizes at that point, I can no longer, live by those ideals, because this is what happened to the person who kept those ideals all the way through.
Right.
So, fuck it, bring on harmony.
And I think, like you said, this movie is simply about asking questions.
Yeah.
And about wondering, like, what if, or is it this, in this case, nature, or is it nurture? What is better, being in sanitized hell, or in a completely corrupted, warlike hell? Would you prefer to be in a place where they kill you with kindness, or where they kill you with real emotions, which is hatred and lust and self-preservation?
But at the same token, it's like you also get to, eat those greaseball burgers. You get to have those tacos. If you want to get drunk, you can get drunk. If you want to get high, you can get high.
Mm-hmm.
Something that was really interesting that the film did make it a point to, like, it's a blink and you miss it kind of deal, but you also realize that a lot of the Watch Me countries also are kind of set up to be the affluent ones.
Mm-hmm.
So not everybody in the world has Watch Me. In fact, it's kind of suggested a lot of the world doesn't, actually. And it's really only the developed nations that are using that. So there's even a probability that the system could still come crashing down on them. So again, it's like the harmony. It's one of those deals where, again, like, the movie is much more about asking those questions than it is about necessarily driving a action-filled plot.
Yeah, and like you said, if you blink at you missed it. With that little tidbit of information, where you see this area where Watch Me is in operation, there still is a choice. I mean, people choose to a certain extent to not have Watch Me. So you still have those two worlds where you have the people who know that Watch Me exists and decide not to take it, and then you have the people who know and do take it.
Yeah, but the choice is really only afforded to those who are outside of the zones that they establish.
Right.
So again, there's a lot of really, like, you can even draw like a big parallel to affluence versus those who are versus poverty.
Mm-hmm.
Some other films that touched upon that were like Elysium was probably like the biggest example. Battle Angel Alita touches upon that a great deal as well. So
another thing that makes this movie forces you to ask questions is, I think the best line in the entire movie is that when Tuan describes Neok, she says, this is a girl who knew too much and hated even more. Which I think is fascinating because, in my experience, when something traumatic happens to an individual, you have two choices. You either shut down or go into what I would say is hyper research, which is what she did. She read and read and read books, and there's also this very nice line where Neok says, if you want to be completely shut out of the world, you read a book, a printed book, because it's just you and the pages.
Yeah, because at that point, at that point, technology is even more advanced than it is now. So, everybody is using, like HoloLens technology, so you could read books like in your contact lens. But the very fact that she chose to go with something that's like more of an older style, is kind of interesting in that. And that, again, it's kind of that hearkening back to old ways, and old styles of doing things,
Yeah.
If you, on a hilarious note, it's kind of like hipsters, who their whole deal is like, I remember the good old days, with my PBR and my, fingerless gloves, and, I remember when Nirvana had bleach, and that was the hot stuff.
Right.
I'm saying this with an entirely, southern accent.
Yeah.
By the way.
Yeah, and I'll grow my own food, I'll sew my own clothes.
Yeah.
etc., etc.
Yeah, so it goes back to that whole ideal of, the constant burying oneself in your youth versus
right, and
taking the steps of maturation.
Right. And I think by this, by making you see two poles, two extremes, it almost forces you to have to look at the middle, right? Because you notice, that either of these choices are not working out. So what can work out? And I think that's really what the movie wants to show you.
Yeah, it's at the end of the day, it's very much an open-ended exercise by the end of it, because you don't really get, a defined conclusion. Not even by anime trope standards. I think this is more out there than a lot of anime tropes, which tend to leave very open-ended questions. This is even more so. So the whole point is to get you to take a look at these situations and actually apply your own critical thinking to it.
Exactly. So, in conclusion, I would like to point to things that I like the most, although you pretty much know by now what I like the most and what I didn't like the most from this movie. So I guess we'll start with what I didn't like and then compare it to what I did like. So what I didn't like was... and I'm not being sexist, but I didn't like so much this idea that it's only women that are the main characters. I thought that was too forced, too arbitrary, too artificial. Which maybe that was the point, because the whole movie was showing artificiality versus nature, blah blah blah. The other thing, again, the dialogue, the storytelling was a little too maybe contrived, maybe too guided. It was maybe too guided. But then again, when you want to show one extreme and another, you can't do too much with that. You can't get too creative. And I think that they went a little too far with the emotions, as you said. They could have made it a little more balanced and painted a more a kinder picture to technology, because in the end, even though everybody looked the same, talked the same, blah blah blah, they were living very long lives, and they didn't age the way normally people would age. So that kind of storytelling is what put me off, but that would guide me to tell you what I did like, which was precisely that. I thought it was really well done, and even though at times it was too contrived, I think with an anime, with a format like anime, I think you have to do that sometimes. What are your opinions? What are your ideas?
Well, I actually was completely okay with the main cast being female, because right now, in society in general, we are getting a little bit more accepting of the concept of men being more on the emotional side, but we're still not there yet. The traditional image, even in Japan, is that a male cannot really express emotion. A male has to be locked in. A male has to be the logical side of the spectrum. So for a lot of creators, a lot of the time when it comes to expressing those emotional thoughts and feelings, it's going to be the female side every time right now. Maybe in a couple more decades we'll get to that point where you have more males telling the story. I think if anything, the biggest scene of showing off the more male emotional spectrum is actually coming in the wave of neat light novel stories, where you have the otaku neat who's trying to rebel against the system, but gets sent off into the fantasy world and goes off to have adventures. And I think they're using that to kind of explore that medium right now and test the waters. But with this, I felt that by going with the females, by going with a female voice, I think it still worked out pretty fine. And, because again, as males, we're kind of trained to be much more logical. We're trained to where we have to think of everything as A, B, C, X, Y, Z, and think of everything in plans and quotients and, constants, and not really thinking about the variables as much.
Mm-hmm.
So on that end, again, I think the character lineup we got worked out pretty well. Especially because I think trying to tell this kind of story, you would have had to probably make some more changes if you were going with more of a male cast. And, more than likely, a lot of folks who are watching it, if they were trying to deal with males being kind of mopey about this kind of stuff, it wouldn't do well on TV.
Mm-hmm.
So, I hate to be really cynical about that, but that's just the nature of show business, and especially the anime industry in Japan.
Yeah, that's right.
So, my only main, objections to it were that it has really great concepts and ideals, but trying to make it work in the span of a 2.5 hour movie just didn't really do it justice. They had to concentrate way too much on monologues, which were important to the story, but at the same token, again, if you're not constantly putting yourself in their situation, or you're not constantly applying critical thought to it, it is going to get boring as fuck really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It's, so it's not an anime for everybody.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because I think you're absolutely right. This movie actually reminded me a lot of the live action movie actually that they did on Ghost in the Shell. There's a lot of stuff that is going on, and if you blink, you miss it. And they have to put so much information in 2 hours, and if that's not your cup of tea, then you get bored.
Yeah, it's kind of like I would even say they try to go for information overload with the live action movie, whereas the first Ghost in the Shell anime movie was actually much more of a stripped down affair, only really concentrated on one concept and then just carry that all the way through.
Right.
Whereas you had more time to develop everything through standalone complex. But we're digressing at this point.
Yeah.
Which
with Harmony, there's mention about philosophy and psychology and neurology and human rights and consciousness. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, if you're a fan of these kinds of movies, this is definitely one that you want to watch maybe 2 or 3 times to kind of get everything that's kind of being thrown at you.
Mm-hmm.
Even for me, I watched it and then I needed 24 hours just to digest what I could take on the surface, which is what I'm talking to you guys right now about. Think about what multiple watching can do for you. So yeah, I mean, like I said, it's a pretty good film. You can pick it up off of the Funimation. Not currently up for streaming, but you can either pick up the Blu-ray, DVD, or you can get it digitally from Google Play and iTunes at a little bit of a cheaper price. So definitely one that you guys should look into.
Yeah, I think we're done. This is our conclusion. I'm Adan, the delivery man, and Billy Nuwanda. I'm not gonna quack again. So, do you want to sign us off?
Yes, folks. Good night and good luck.
All right.